Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee. Sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
A quick note off the top, this episode is about the ongoing DWI corruption scandal here in New Mexico. And since we recorded the interview you're about to hear, there have been an additional 3 officers take federal plea deals in the scheme, admitting to their roles. Also, the so-called ringleader and now former longtime defense attorney in Albuquerque, Thomas Clear III, he pled guilty in federal court to 9 counts, including RICO conspiracy, extortion, and bribery charges. He's since admitted to running this DWI Enterprise since 1995, working with law enforcement officers to skirt the law and make extra profits by getting DWI cases dismissed in court. Now, he says his paralegal, Ricardo Rick Mendez, also got involved in the scheme in 2008 after Clear hired him. Now, for this episode, Chris and I talked to a longtime DWI advocate about this case. And when we did this interview, Rick Mendez was the first person and the only one at the time to take a plea deal. But again, more people have been officially charged and pled guilty to federal crimes in this scheme, and there could be even more coming. So for now, here is our conversation with Linda Atkinson. This story has consumed most of my bandwidth at work over the last few weeks. If you're paying attention at all to New Mexico news happenings, we recently saw the first person federally charged in what's become one of the biggest public corruption schemes in our state.
Yeah, Ricardo Rick Mendez, who worked as a paralegal here in Albuquerque for a local attorney's office, he recently pleaded guilty to racketeering or RICO charges, conspiracy charges in federal court. He basically is admitting to working with law enforcement officers from the Albuquerque Police Department, the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, and also New Mexico State Police, essentially taking money to ensure defendants' DWIs would be dismissed in court.
The federal plea deal states officers would filter DWI suspects to Mendez, who would then encourage people to pay cash for their retainer, and then he'd help arrange for officers to intentionally miss court, leading to a DWI case getting dismissed. So in exchange for a DWI dismissal, Mendez says these officers or co-conspirators were paid in cash, but also received other benefits, such as, quote, free legal services, gift cards, hotel rooms, and other gifts.
So in the year since that we learned that the FBI is continuing to investigate this scheme, our KRQE Investigates team, of course, that's Gabby, as well as Ann Perrette, who's been on this podcast before. You guys have uncovered a lot of pieces of the puzzle here, published a lot of stories on air and online. The story clearly is not over, though, we should point out, and we do expect more developments in the weeks and months to come. So just to set a timestamp here, where we're at right now, we are recording this here in early February, and so far Mendez has been the only person facing federal charges in this scheme, or rather have entered a plea here in this scheme. But keep in mind, he has admitted in that plea to working with others.
Yeah, and there is a lot to unpack in this story. Like Chris said, it continues to evolve. I'm sure we will get updates from this recording to when we publish. But for today's conversation, we've brought in Linda Atkinson. She is the executive director of the DWI Resource Center. And for years, Linda, you've been involved with victim advocacy, paid close attention to just the problem of DWI in New Mexico. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we appreciate you being here.
You were one of the first people I called on Friday when these charges came down. I want to go back to just that moment, reading over the documents. What was your initial reaction reading through this guilty plea deal with Rick Mendez?
You know, after doing this for as long as I have, I can't say it was surprising. It was jaw-dropping, quite frankly, because he articulates everything that he did knowingly and knowing it was a crime. And for it to continue 15 years, those were the jaw-dropping moments for me.
You know, we brought you here because you co-founded the DWI Resource Center and Victims' Rights Project, and we wanted to talk a little bit more about that. Why did you found that group? What compelled you to do it? And when was that?
I'm known for dropping names, and I must say there was a group of us very discouraged with MAD because I had volunteered with them for a long time. And so we wanted to start our own organization that actually focused on, data-driven, research-based solutions to reduce DWI death and injury. So that was back in '92. And we received our 501c3 in 1994. And that was, ancient, many years ago. And what we wanted to do, of course, was focus on how do we reduce death and injury. And I'd already had a big focus on the courts. I'd been doing analysis and court monitoring for a very long time and was continuing to do that. We would release report cards on the judges as far as dismissals, which put me at the top of their list of most loved, not.
Yeah. It's
so
certainly something when you have something to say and the data to back up what judges are doing in court. It's not taken too lightly.
I have to say it was rather, to me, humorous when we'd present the data. It's backed up by the citation tracking system, not just anecdotal. And the reporters would ask the judges, so what do you have to say about this? That's true, but, and they'd have a lot of excuses.
What do you think has been the outcome since you started it? Do you feel like you've helped make a difference and progress? Maybe what are the things that come to mind for you?
Go back a year and ask me that, because right now I feel nothing was accomplished. It's like everything that we worked for to reduce DWI death and injury, the rug's pulled out from under you when you hear how long this scandal's been going on. But from '92, I'd say until about 2004 or 5, we were doing court monitoring, releasing reports. And then, like I say, I do name names, and there was a state agency that was holding we had a contract, and they started, in a sense, upset with us because we had bought a bookcase and they wanted it charged under capital outlay. This is the petty stuff, right? And in federal accounting for nonprofits, that's a supply. So we had a bit of a disagreement about that. And I don't think they were that pleased with the work we were doing because it rattles cages.
Right.
So that was sort of you need to shut up and sit down, Linda. So we backed off. And it was a few years later that I saw that the court monitoring still needed to go on because the changes that the court had promised were ineffectual from what I was seeing and hearing, talking with DWI victims. And so I did write a proposal to do court monitoring again, and I was underbid or overbid by MAD. It didn't matter. They just didn't want to contract with me. So that was the end of our court monitoring.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because at one point they asked me to review their report, and I was shocked with what they were. I'm like, what is this? It was all, it wasn't based on the data.
Yeah. Do you have, I know obviously you spent a lot of your career talking with victims of DWI. Do you have a personal connection with DWI?
My personal connection is being married to an alcoholic, and the person I was with before that also had drug and alcohol issues. Seems to be my pattern. So it was a matter of realizing that what I was going through, just as, in a sense, I was the enabler. So that's, my big lesson, too, in my role there. And finding that there were ways to overcome that made me even more passionate about trying to keep other families safe. I mean, my ex would call and say, I'm going to go driving with my daughter in the car. And I was, of course, freaking out. And I've talked to victims that happens to them. So we do the best we can to help them in their divorce custody cases, in any DWI cases that individual's involved in.
Yeah. And to that point, I think I wanted to ask you as well, what is the work you concentrate on now here in 2025?
Now, what happened, we used to be able to get the data from the citation tracking system. DWI citations have a unique number. It was a huge database. And the state started converting, it was MVD, converting to the Real ID, so the data they said wasn't available, which really hampered our efforts to hold certain agencies accountable for the money they were receiving. And so the focus then became more on all victims of violent crime. So we started the Victims' Rights Project under the DWI Resource Center. We work with all victims of violent crime.
I see.
And you and I have talked a lot about just the issue of officers missing court and the problem of who gets notified in that whole process, what kind of oversight there is with different law enforcement agencies. It seems like a convoluted web a little bit when you consider all the law enforcement agencies who have to go to court for these things. But it is not just criminal court matters. I also found a widespread problem of officers failing to appear at administrative MVD license revocation hearings. So let's just start there. Let's talk about that a little bit. When someone is arrested for DWI, there's a court case for the criminal matter, and then there's also, in some cases, when someone wants to fight the automatic revocation of their driver's license in New Mexico, they can request an administrative license hearing. So as someone who's paid close attention to our state laws on this, can you just tell us, why does it work this way? What is the intention behind a license revocation hearing?
Well, when we go back to the original research coming out on impaired driving, this is one of the swift, sure, and certain punishments we found worked, is to take the driver's license away. And so administrative license revocation, I think this state was one of the first few in the country that did that. And it has the deterrent of someone driving without a license. Now, that was 30 years ago, so we have seen change in behavior and change in how people think about that, with fewer law enforcement out there. So that was the administrative license revocation. We realized early on, when the hearings, the defense attorneys for these offenders asking for the hearings wanted the officers there. And an administrative hearing, if you look at the true definition and how it should work, it's administrative. And if an officer says, this is what we found, laying the foundation and actually pointing out what they observed, because there's about 4 points that the hearing officer reviews, then why did the officer need to be there? And several of us were fighting to get just the officer's statement, basically under oath, this is what happened, instead of calling the officer in. But I'm just going to say this, I think we're a bunch of idiots for thinking that you have to do it the way defense attorneys want. And that's been our downfall, I think, really from day one. So that's where having an officer be present for the administrative license revocation hearing is another hurdle, in essence, to hold DWI offenders accountable. And of course, a lot of times what defense attorneys do, I understand that changed in 2022, is these pretrial interviews, which are, again, please, I just think we're idiots about this. We do it within the violent crime cases as well, where that pretrial interview, so you're not only doing administrative license revocation, you're doing the pretrial interview, and then you go to trial, theoretically. You look at data, the majority of the cases plea. But what happens then, too, a lot of times is dismissals, because the officers now, back in the day, they had their priorities. Your priority is court, and that goes federal, district, then metro. And most DWIs are in metro court, just for Albuquerque. So if you have an administrative license revocation hearing the same day as your metro court hearing, you're going to go to metro court, not the ALR.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And you consider staffing issues. Officers have obviously other obligations than just going to these court hearings and administrative hearings. You start to stack up the calendar, it seems like, and realize what I found also in the data when we did this story together was widespread absentee issues.
The FTAs, we call
Failure to appear, yes.
Correct.
Yeah. And there's certainly as well many more cases that come through the courts as well, as another factor, I would imagine. Let's just go back to a little bit about what we learned in the filing tied to Mendez's plea. Federal investigators call this, quote, a DWI Enterprise. In his guilty plea, Mendez says that senior officers or, quote, other APD officer members who had worked in the DWI unit and were part of the scheme helped to recruit and train the next generation of officer members as part of this enterprise. What does that tell you about how long this went on for, basically unchecked?
It's disturbing. It really is, to think they were getting away with it unfettered. And I have to say, I met with my board chair. He used to be chief of Traffic Safety Bureau, a big data person. We were talking a little bit about what was going on, and the fact that these officers, in a sense, it was nothing new to see FTAs. What was new about this was the enterprise aspect, the recruitment, the length of time it was going on, how coordinated, like a regular enterprise. But to compare it to, what had been going on, that we kept trying to curtail was all these pretrial interviews and these ALRs conflicting with trial dates. So it's as if this didn't, like I said, surprise me. It sort of bears out what we were seeing in data prior. But as far as what we were doing as monitors, we would go and talk to the supervising of the law enforcement agency, or even the prosecutors that walk into court without a file folder, to go and talk to their supervisors. You know, your officers failed to appear. What is the excuse? We need to see if you're doing any type of accountability for their failure to appear. So this kind of seems to have just fallen off the cliff at some point.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Logan Rader, host of New Mexico Living. New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS.
If you like New Mexico News Insiders, learn more about New Mexico in Focus, a weekly hour-long show analyzing decisions impacting New Mexico statewide. Stream it anytime, anywhere. Visit nmpbs.org and follow them on all social media platforms.
Now back to New Mexico News Insiders.
One thing I will point out about the failure to appear, because that is something that, you know, one would start to notice in data, but what struck me in this plea was that's not the only way that this enterprise worked, right? Mendez admits he would coordinate with officers' calendars so they would potentially have a good excuse, so they would not face discipline for missing a court hearing. But in some cases, they also just wouldn't file the paperwork properly or wouldn't file a criminal complaint. And that is harder to catch in the data.
True.
When you're looking at cases. So it was just, like you said, an enterprise, and there wasn't just one way. They were kind of weaving through the system, it seems.
Yeah, it's almost like evaluate and review and improve is what I was kind of seeing as the pattern through all these years of them doing that.
Wow. And if you take a step back, just a bird's eye view of this scheme, one of the things, again, that is so striking to me, officers implicated were tasked with cracking down on DWI. I mean, the DWI unit was implicated. So that is, they were tasked with taking drunk drivers off the street, ensuring the roads are presumably safer without this person driving drunk by way of a consequence, right? So an attorney with the ACLU put it this way to me. He said, this scheme sends a message to the public that a court outcome can be bought and sold, meaning if you have money, well, you don't have to worry about the consequences. Right. So as someone who's lived here a long time, paid attention to the problems of DWI, if you were to try and paint a picture to an outsider, someone who's not from here or familiar with New Mexico, how big of a problem is DWI in New Mexico?
Huge. It's huge. And I think what always gets us is the fact we know it's preventable. And all the fatalities, the injuries, these lifelong injuries, paraplegia, quadriplegia, the traumatic brain injuries, they could all be avoided. And that's what we look to law enforcement as the first step in that blockade. And when you see them falling down, it's such a disservice to the community. There is, I think, at times a false sense of security because somebody might be putting out through the media that, oh, they made all these arrests. Well, you have to always balance that with how many crashes were occurring at the same time. And that's something you learn early on in data. You don't just look at one piece. You've got to look at the whole picture. And that's, you know, I think very sad. And I think it's going to be a high hurdle to overcome.
What strikes me like one of these questions is like, how did we get here? You know, was it because of things like having to do so many of these pretrial interviews? Is it because we have created such a, you know, financially penalizing system that they saw, you know, maybe there is a way to get a cut of money out of this? Like, how did we get
Bingo.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what we were talking about is if you think about all the time they put, because the other thing officers have to do, sleep. So they're in court all day, then they go patrol at night. And if they're seeing the revolving door of them putting their life on the line, and it's just for naught. And I mean, I talked to many officers about this, you know, over the years, and they say it's always worth it to get that one impaired driver off the road. And somewhere along the line, that philosophy has been lost, especially on these guys. I think there's still some good ones there, you know, but the fact that to have to go here, there, everywhere, and the onus becomes on them, that burden, that I can see where somebody would say, easy way out is I'll get paid anyway for the overtime. And if it's just easier to go this path of least resistance and get paid, I think I'll do that. That was my supposition of how many would do this and how I've seen the courts.
And you see officers get discouraged by probably also not seeing consequences.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's disheartening, and it affects morale, and trying to address that, I think, does lie with the chief of police and the mayor who appoints him. So I think everybody's got some culpability here.
Well, as of this recording, there have been at least 13 officers within APD who've been named by the department targets of APD's internal affairs investigation into this scheme. So most of those officers have retired or resigned rather than being interviewed by internal affairs. Some are now on the Bernalillo County District Attorney's Giglio list, which means those officers are basically no longer considered credible as witnesses in court. And of course, we know that from the start, that this has led to the dismissal of hundreds of DWI cases, at least 230 involving these officers by our most recent count, here again recording this in early February. So Linda, considering not just court case dismissals, but DWIs that were never even properly filed or tried in the years that the scheme went on, what do you think are the effects or the community impact of so many DWI dismissals? We know at least 230. We believe there are many more.
I'm with you on that. Well, the impact is the public trust in law enforcement. You know, how do we trust them to do their jobs? How do we trust them to follow through to provide some sense of safety on the streets? And we're all drivers. I mean, that's what we do. We get in our cars and we drive point A to point B. And you always hope you get from point A to point B safely. But when you know how many impaired drivers are in this state, it can be like 1 in 7 drivers. Friday night, count them as you're going down the road, 1 in 7. Used to be 1 in 3, so big improvement? I'm not sure.
Wow. The Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, they recently placed a deputy on leave pending this investigation. We still don't know the official names of any New Mexico State police officers who were involved, but the state police chief told me recently that he is conducting an internal audit and cooperating with the federal investigation. Linda, what would you like to see from our local law enforcement agencies in response to this?
I want to see what they think fixes it. I have ideas, but I want to know when I think the chief has said, well, we fixed it. How? And theoretically, they're going to depend on the DA's office. Like I said, these citations have a unique number. And why can't they track them themselves? Why aren't they gathering their own data on what's happening with their officers and DWI citations? I don't think that's a stretch. So instead of hearing we fixed it, I have very little trust or faith that they have, air quotes, fixed it, because we've seen these and heard about these fixes, well, for many years, 20 years I've been hearing it.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned you had some of your own ideas, and I was curious, you mind sharing one of those about, like, what do you think needs to be done?
That transparency. The courts need to be transparent. How many DWI cases are actually going to trial? How many are bench trial? How many are pled? How many are getting dismissed because of officer FTA? That's a big one, because that's what this issue is, right? Why don't they publish that data? That's what always got me. We can access the data as a, Susie Q citizen, go to MVD through Traffic Safety Bureau and ask for the data and do the analysis. Why do we do it as Susie? Why aren't the law enforcement agencies doing it? The courts. Why aren't they being more transparent?
Mm-hmm. About the fixing issue, APD did address this in a document that they did release. We have it published on krqa.com, but basically some of their ideas for fixing it is changing some of the SOPs for the DWI unit, the standard operating procedures, based on how they understand the scheme worked and how they can hopefully prevent some of that operation from happening in the future, including kind of an independent oversight of that unit and of these cases. So just putting that out there, APD did come to us with some changes that they will be making, including new rules on what officers can accept and not accept as gifts from attorneys or anyone outside. So,
Your thoughts? I mean,
I'm like, really? You can't accept gifts? That has to be spelled out for these yahoos? I'm sorry, but that's annoying. That is just so annoying.
Yeah, it's an interesting point there. You would think that there's a hard and fast rule of no.
And, I want to hone in on who's they are going to fix it, who's they that's going to oversee it. I want names. I want to know specifically. I want to see the SOP. I want to see it in action. I want to see the buy-in. I mean, to think that public trust can be gained back by saying we fixed it and they will do this, I have zero trust, and I don't think I'm alone in that.
And a lot of that will have to kind of come with time, right? And we'll have to pay attention over a span of time and months and see, are there changes?
Well, I think we should go down to court right now and sit in one of the courtrooms. That's when you see what actually plays out with what SOPs are and who they are. I wish I had the vim and vigor or could, just magically have 3 or 4 court monitors to go sit in those courts again and watch what happens. Because the proof is in the pudding. I'm sorry. I don't even think it takes time, really, Gabrielle. I don't. I think that today we could go down and see, is anything different?
Yeah, that's a good point.
What about the work of the investigators here? The U.S. Attorney's Office, the FBI, have been central in, as we've seen now, Ricardo Mendez taking this guilty plea here in this case. Are there any other outcomes you want to see from these agencies, whether that be other criminal cases, further investigations?
Knowing that we got wind of it a year ago, I don't know how long they'd been investigating, till we found out. Wasn't it January last year?
Yeah, it was.
And now it's been a year, so there's been 1 indictment, 1 plea agreement, and we're talking about how many individuals? 13 from APD.
Yeah, that have been named.
I mean, to say I want it further investigated is one thing. I think I speak for the public. We want results. I work cases. Homicide, sexual assault, the DWI, where there's great bodily injury. And these cases alone can take up to a year. And so now we're at a year with the feds on this. So I think that for me, I just, the patience wears thin to think that more will be coming. I'd like to think there will be, and we'll get this resolved and we won't see it happening anymore. But right now I sit here with very little faith.
You've mentioned you've had conversations and connections with families that have been affected by these crimes. Has that come up in your conversations over the last year, their reaction to this scheme?
Oh, God. I think that they're huge disgust. It is extremely traumatic when another victim who's lost a loved one or going through still rehabbing with serious injuries, to hear of another crash that took another life, and then you hear how this scheme was playing out to let drunk drivers back on the road. It's more than disheartening. It's actually traumatic. It's triggering. And, how as one who talks with them, I sit there and empathize with them and cannot fix it. I can't fix it. I have a voice. I'll use my voice. I will advocate for them as hard as I can because some of the cases are still pending. But there's just so many fallacies in the system that I see it. That's going to be the long haul, the time.
Mm-hmm. Aside from journalists, advocates like you, whose job it is to pay attention to cases like this, now that we know there's public corruption, just general news consumers, who else, in your view, should be paying attention to this case?
Judges. Without hesitation, judges. I mean, they want to say they're independent, but I have observed enough judges to say, no, they're not. I would like to think, but no, they're not. They have a prejudice towards the state or towards defense, and I see more defense-leaning judges than I do state. And I think also the agencies that fund these agencies, like Traffic Safety Bureau, the federal money flows through them. I think they have a role in this. I mean, I would take it all the way up to the governor's office. For years, we've talked about what does it take really to start reducing death and injury? Leadership, and leadership at a high level. And the governor to go and have cabinet secretaries that report to her. Nobody's gone to the Secretary of Department of Transportation, which Traffic Safety Bureau sits under, to see what they knew, which I'll put all my year's salary on. Nothing. They knew nothing. But they are the keepers of the data. So why aren't they watching it also? They're doling out the federal dollars. I mean, I get grants, and I have to be accountable to the grantor. I have to, tell them exactly what we did over what period of time, and that's just the nature of grants. And these grants coming out of the state have evidently gone unfettered and unaccountable, and I think it's a shame. So I think there's a whole plethora that's in this DWI Enterprise, whether they were personally recruited by complicity, they're part of it, I think.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hi, I'm Monica Wicki, host of New Mexico Living. This episode of New Mexico News Insiders is sponsored by New Mexico PBS. If you enjoy New Mexico News Insiders, check out New Mexico in Focus, a great source for insights about what's happening in our state. Catch their podcasts and videos at nmpbs.org or stream it anytime, anywhere on the free PBS app. Now, let's continue to New Mexico News Insiders.
Is there anything else that you want to add? I know there's so much we could probably talk about here, but anything we didn't ask you that you want to add?
It's not that you didn't ask, but I want to, for people in the community that are angry about this, go sit in the courts, take notes, call me. We'll compile it. We'll put it on our website. We'll try to direct you to who to talk to. If it's the chief of police, if it's the prosecutor, if it is whatever state agency had something to do with it, if it's the judges. With my court monitors, we would go and introduce ourselves to the judges, have conversation with them about what we were gathering, and that we would be happy to provide feedback. I don't think that happens anymore. And I think judges need to have that feedback. And I think many would appreciate it, because waiting for things to hit the news doesn't usually sit well with people. So if they have the opportunity to address it before it gets to that point, I've seen many that are willing to.
Well, Linda Atkinson, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you for having me.
Again, thanks to Linda Atkinson for joining us for this conversation today. And we should note that, of course, if you are interested in reading and watching these stories our KRQE Investigates team has all put together and covered in this corruption scandal over the last year now, go to krqe.com. You can click the news tab and then go to the APD DWI investigations section. You'll see all of our related coverage on that landing page, and there's quite a bit of it.
Yeah, our web team, shout out to the web team. They also put together an interactive timeline that includes officers who have been named when they worked in the DWI unit, and it's a really helpful tool if you're interested in just clicking through and scrolling and seeing what we've got on there. Thanks to everyone also who's messaged me and Ann over the last couple weeks about this story. I do read your emails. We are following up on tips constantly, so keep the tips coming. You can always reach me at gabrielle.burkhart@krqe.com via email and gburknm on social media.
I'm at Chris McKee TV and also chris.mckee@krqe.com. Also, you can leave a comment on Spotify to these episodes. Let us know what you think. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening and watching.